Hey everyone, and welcome to the 55th episode of the Liam McCollum Show. This episode was recorded on June 23rd, 2021. Alright, today's guest is my high school honor civics teacher, Lee Deming. I wanted to bring one thing up since it wasn't mentioned in the interview, and that's that Mr. Deming is largely responsible for me becoming a libertarian, but he also helped coach my graduating class to win the Center for Civic Education's We the People Montana State competition, and also win Montana's first ever award at Nationals. You'll hear that competition brought up later in the interview for more context, but I figured I'd bring that up because we didn't dive into it. I hope you enjoy this interview, and now that Mr. Deming's retired, I expect that I'll have him on quite a bit. Here he is. All right, so I have a really awesome interview today. It's with someone that is pretty important to me and someone I consider a mentor and a friend, someone who helped with my development as a libertarian and just kind of where I'm at now politically and intellectually and everything. It's Mr. Deming, Lee Deming. He was my teacher my senior year of high school in civics. And now, Mr. Deming, I'm assuming that just if there's anyone who's following me on social media and they see this post and they say, oh, wow, Liam is interviewing Mr. Deming, they're going to listen to this. So I figured that we would kind of talk about who you are and what your beliefs are. And I also assume that a lot of people maybe thought that you were a Republican while going through school. So can we talk a little bit about your political beliefs and how you became a libertarian?
Yeah, sure. So when I first started teaching, I grew up in the era of the Vietnam War. And so starting teaching in 1978, we pretty much knew throughout the last few years of the war, during the time I was in high school, that the government was lying to us about a lot of stuff. And so I was pretty skeptical of government at all levels, but I think that's the reason why I was. And even though I voted Republican because I didn't really know there was a libertarian option at the time, and there wasn't most of the time, I'm pretty socially conservative. And so I think the first part of my career, I was a Republican, or considered myself to be, even though I never joined any party. And occasionally I'd vote independent, and I've written a lot of candidates in. But I guess the first couple of decades of my career, yeah, I was a Republican for sure.
And then when I met you, I'll say it was kind of interesting because how I became a libertarian, I think I woke up to the whole, logic of, or I broke out of partisanship and I saw you would criticize Trump, but also criticize Obama. And I got to see you criticize Obama first. I think it was Obamacare or something like that. And that kind of trapped me. And I was like, oh, well, he must be on my side. But then like a few days later, you said something bad about Trump. So that got me pretty intrigued. But later in our conversations, you started to bring up Ron Paul. You had pictures of Ron Paul in your classroom. And I didn't know who he was at the time, but did Ron Paul kind of influence you? I know a lot of people became libertarians during his election.
About 20 years ago, my brother actually asked me, have you ever heard of this Ron Paul guy? And I had, but I didn't know much about him. And the only thing I knew about him was that he was some crackpot guy that was always worried about the Fed and didn't like wars. Well, I didn't know much about the Federal Reserve Bank either. Even though I don't know if you knew this, I did work for those guys for a while. So the Federal Reserve. Yeah, I didn't have a very important job, obviously, but I did work for them. I didn't know anything about him really. But the more I looked into Ron Paul and I spoke to my brother at length about him, the better I liked him. And so he was pretty easy for me to support in the 2008 election campaign, to be honest with you. So that's kind of where I turned, particularly the anti-war stuff. Growing up in that Vietnam era, I think I got sick of the excuses that people used to use for our involvement in Vietnam. And I had a couple other unique experiences. I knew some Hmong tribesmen that we had in class in one of the places I taught. And one of them I still consider a very close friend today. And he was related to one of the most famous, if not the most famous, anti-communist generals in the world. And his name was Vang Pao. So anyway, I think I knew quite a bit about a lot of the wars the United States was in, and I started going through using the same litmus test as Vietnam and all of the wars we've been involved in, and I just they're all a bunch of crap as far as I'm concerned. So.
Yeah, definitely. And then, yeah, so that's pretty interesting. So I've told people that you're a public school teacher, and I've had to tell people, you know, like I became a libertarian within the public school system. Like luckily I found a libertarian my senior year of high school. And it's kind of funny. They're all surprised, but now it's even funnier because you also work for the Federal Reserve System.
Yeah.
You're a libertarian. What was your job?
Yeah. So all I did was the job was called a mail clerk / driver. So all we did is deliver the mail. But it was at the Federal Reserve Bank of Helena, Minneapolis branch, Helena branch, Minneapolis Federal Reserve. And I spent quite a bit of time there, and they worked with my college schedule. So we'd go to work at 5 a.m, and then we'd leave work to go to class, and then we'd finish up. So I'd get 40, 50 hours a week at that job because they worked with my schedule, and also do a full load of classes at Carroll College.
Wow. Yeah. So now to get into like just the education side, how long were you a teacher, and when did you find out that you wanted to become a teacher, I guess?
So I finished my 43rd year this last year, retired. And when I went to college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and it was really expensive. And so I had to figure out something with the things that I was interested in. And I asked my dad, I said, what do I do? What do I study? He says, well, just find some stuff you're interested in. So I was interested in history and political science. And so there wasn't much else I could do but be a teacher. And then I also kind of wanted to be a coach, a basketball coach, which I was for a while. But the academics just drew me in, to be honest with you. I really like athletics. I really like coaching, but there's really nothing like spending some time with some kids who are adults or just almost adults and hashing out history, the real history, and politics. That's been an awful fun career, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And I think that the way that your class was structured, at least when I was in it, and that was in 2018, was just very unique. And I think what you were able to bring with like the Center for Civic Education and stuff like that. And I've always told you, and we've talked about this in the past, that like the freedom that you gave to ask questions and for us to pursue things that we were interested in. I think that that's like, it's the best way for people to learn. But can you kind of talk about what that class structure was like? And I guess how long were you in We the People? And can you explain what that program was like?
Yeah, so it's 2 decades, essentially, I spent in that program. And the Center for Civic Education sets up a system class, and they do some other programs as well, but it's called the We the People program. And what they do is they gear it towards district, state, and then national competitions in civics. And the book is structured to be set up to have 6 units. And essentially what you're talking about throughout the entire text is, as you well know, the history, philosophy, and application of constitutional principles. And so each of the 6 units has a different topic. And your topic, unit 1, that is still my favorite unit, is really the philosophy behind the Constitution. And, you know, teachers and kids have told me over the years, teachers in We the People program have told me over the years that that's the one they like the least because it's too much philosophy. Well, how do you make sense of the rest of it if you don't have the philosophy down? I don't understand that. So, and the other thing I don't understand is that if you don't have a good grounding in that, do something about it. If you're a teacher and you're supposed to teach these kids these principles and you don't know it, you need to learn. And so I think a lot of people, teachers, it's tough to get teachers involved in the program because I think it's an awful lot of work. So I used to spend at least 100 hours in the summer times, kind of getting ready for classes. And so when I walk in there, I could answer most of the questions you guys had. But remember, the way that I structured that class was to rely on your curiosity and your reason rather than mine. My role is to kind of guide you to your own answer rather than to tell you what mine is. And you probably remember that pretty well.
Yeah, I do. I mean, because I didn't even really find out that you were a libertarian until, I mean, because you were very clear that you would be open with your beliefs, and you weren't necessarily doing it to like press them on people. It was just like, this is what I believe in, and hopefully you can learn from that in a way. But it was also, I didn't learn that you were actually a libertarian until maybe halfway through the school year, and that was because I was just constantly asking you questions and trying to get to this point and building a foundation towards that. But I mean, it really was my own questions that kind of helped, and then you were just helpful in answering them. But I mean, yeah, the class was really great, and the philosophy section was my favorite, and why I'm majoring in philosophy now. And I think that it's probably the most important part about libertarianism. There's a big conflict right now about whether or not people are on the ground in the Libertarian Party right now, if they actually understand the philosophy behind it. And I think that is a serious problem. And the way that libertarians can differentiate themselves from Republicans and Democrats is to ground the party in philosophy. Otherwise, you're just another coalition, reacting to whatever that day's issue is. But yeah, to talk more about like the system itself and maybe why because when I talked to you about when you would ever retire and stuff like that, you said when you got bored of it or when you no longer had fun. So I'm just curious, were you seeing something within the system that you no longer liked, or was it more of a personal decision?
No, actually, I could have easily taught another 10 years, particularly as I think, and okay, this is going to sound different, but I think that kids are getting more sophisticated rather than less. The upper end kids, like yourself, the kids who are curious, have intellectual curiosity, their understanding is frankly pretty weak, but their ability to find information is unbelievably sophisticated. I'd be talking about something, I can't remember this guy's name. Before I had the sentence out, somebody had the answer. They knew who it was. And so it wasn't just a matter of getting the name, they would find out about the person. That's happened for a number of years, and increasingly I see that in the classroom. So clearly I could have been there longer. I was enjoying every second of it. And thankfully I had a really, really good bunch of students this year. And again, particularly in honor civics class, I was very happy with their effort and their knowledge base. So, but I came to the conclusion that I'm still relatively young, and I wanted to be able to do some stuff, camp and hunt and fish while I was still healthy.
Yeah.
I'm still relatively healthy. So,
and be more politically, maybe.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Yeah, the other thing I want to make sure I say here before I forget, I got to tell you, thank you for helping to prepare those kids for our competitions last few years. That's been very, very helpful, and I've really appreciated it. You've been the most consistent person to help me on that. I know you like it, but it's been pretty important to me to see you do that. So thank you.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to make sure you understood is that I didn't really do a lot except to give you guys the permission to go figure out on your own the things that you believe rather than anything else. And so I know that works well for a lot of students, and it clearly worked well for you. But remember, you would ask me a question, and typically I would make make it clear that I wasn't going to give you the answer, but I could direct you to an answer that fit your philosophy. And so my role was to guide rather than teach. And that, as I said, that's worked very well for the right student. It doesn't work well for everyone. I remember several times in class, we'd get questions and I wouldn't answer. Like the one question, well, I asked you about World War II, did we have to fight World War II? And I said, well, why did World War II start? So I answered that with a question. Now you got to go find out why World War II started. And now you're going all the way back to World War One, and you can follow it back to the history throughout the history of the United States. And so I think I want to make sure I said that it wasn't any great insight on my part. It was the fact that I kind of let you guys have your free reign, and look what you did. You turned into a philosophy major, and you've got a podcast, and you're into the Libertarian Party of Montana, Mises Caucus. Yeah, I think it worked.
Yeah, it's definitely like because you're definitely responsible for a lot of it in the way that you were able to at least the environment that the class like provided to inspire, I guess, that. And it was very, I mean, you're definitely right that you would never give me the answers too. I know there were many times where like I came to a conclusion that I remember this pretty vividly in unit 4, because I was in 2 different units in We the People for the listener. Unit 4 was about the political structure of the US government. And we were just talking about like the conflicts and like the built-in maybe problems with the Constitution, if there were any. And I remember I can't remember what the question was, but we were preparing for the competition, and I remember my eyes got so wide because essentially the whole idea was about compromise and whether or not compromise is good or bad. And then you just told me like there was something that led me to the conclusion that the entire system, especially based off of the Philadelphia Convention, was built on compromise between these 2 parties, and that might be where the flaws come from. And it was constantly just stuff like this where I was asking questions, and really it was up to the student to see whether or not they wanted to take advantage of that.
Yep, that's exactly right. You've captured it for sure. And
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you, 20 years ago, I didn't have that. I didn't do that with the students. That was more of an evolution on my part, where I got to the point where I wanted the kids to find their own answers. But before, 20 years ago, when I first started in there, I was trying to give everybody all the answers, and I just didn't have them all. Which is too bad, I guess. But I think it works out better when you guys find your own.
Yeah, and then for the listener who might not understand what he was saying earlier, like with all my help, I would go in and help judge these kids, or if they had any questions, I would point them in a direction. And I may have given my bias a little more than Mr. Deming does. I would literally just say, yeah, look here, or this is what I think. But what's great, and he's right about these students, is like there were some people who were pretty left leaning that I really respect, who would combat me a little, and I think that was so great. That's what was so great about the environment in this class. But I've talked to you personally, and we were going to have this conversation with some of the LP people, just about the problems that you see in the public education system right now. And I don't know how much you want to get into that, but I know that you believe in homeschooling and stuff like this, and that might seem a little interesting to some people who are like, well, you taught in the public education system for so long, why would you tell people to homeschool? So do you want to dive into that conversation?
Yeah, we can do that. So I do think that your public education is going to be rife with those who uh, really believe in socialism as a way of life, we should impose, um, get rid of capitalism or heavily regulate capitalism, that the state should make all the decisions for us. I mean, our our union. This is an interesting story, and it's public. Everybody knows it. But our teachers union at our district, the superintendent wanted to follow the mandates of the governor, and the governor lifted the mask mandates for schools. And our union threatened to sue the district
Wow.
to keep following the national guidelines, which included still masking students in schools. And so the district wanted to let the kids stop wearing their masks. And the union said, no, we don't want that. So uh, just imagine seeing a bunch of kids and we had about a week where we didn't have to have masks, walk in. Thank goodness we're done with the masks. Everybody's thrilled about the masks being gone. And now then you have to tell your kids to put them back on again. So that was led by some members of our teachers union. Now, I don't think there's a clearer example of how badly we have turned in this country, where the state can impose those kinds of restrictions on kids who are at zero risk. Now, statistically, there's no way and in fact, those kids 17 or 18 years of age, they're not going to get sick. If they get sick, they're only going to be sick for a couple of days. It's not going to kill them. And so the mask mandate, this lawsuit was probably to protect the teachers rather than the students. And so I find that to be, frankly, cowardly. Anyway, that's a pretty good example of the power of the state and in people's minds, that the state then must impose that. And if not, then in our case, the union was going to, ruining everybody's livelihoods, locking us down for 18 months or whatever it was. Is there a better example of the lunacy of state control than that?
Yeah.
There isn't, as far as I'm concerned, unless you want to talk about wars.
Well, what about, because this is an interesting topic about unions and how they might operate and hold control over districts and stuff like that. Like, how could they possibly feel as if they have the authority like that? I know that they run off of kind of like a state-based system where they require people to pay dues, but I don't really know much about how they work. And as someone, you had to participate in one, right?
Yeah, in fact, I was on the negotiating committee for a while. I'm pretty involved in the union. Participated in a strike 20, almost 30 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, so the union and the district had this is the way I understand it. So if I have some of the details wrong, I stopped paying attention there for a while. That the district and the union signed a memorandum of agreement where the two parties said that they would follow I believe, the CDC guidelines. So since the governor lifted the mask mandate, but the CDC guidelines were the same, the union was in a position to win a suit against the district, saying that the district had violated that agreement. And so as far as I know, and I'm pretty sure I got that, that sequence of events right, the district really was going to lose that because they had signed that. So there's a lesson learned right there. You want to be careful of the kinds of agreements you sign.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's how it worked out.
I'm just interested, did you ever have a teacher or someone within a union respond poorly to you because of your political beliefs? Or did that ever happen within the public education system? When I know this happened when you would talk to other teachers in We the People, but did it ever happen locally? And then if not, we can talk about those cases.
Yeah, so there was some pushback in the teachers lounge, and very few times officially, obviously, just some banter, but there's been a couple of teachers who really took exception to my way of viewing the world, even though they didn't really know exactly. Like, you thought I was a Republican for a while, and that's what a lot of people think. And in fact, I vote Republican most of the time, but I'm way more libertarian than I am anything else. Now, these people don't know that, and so they make assumptions. And then I've had I've had several comments about the fact that the social studies staff at the high school is, let me say, it's too bad they're all conservative.
Yeah.
Well, in the first place, how do you know that? I might say that in this teacher's lounge around adults, but like, as you said, I try not to tell very many people where I stand politically in class. So imagine someone saying that. Too bad the social studies staff is conservative. Well, you don't know. He maybe he's conservative. I don't know. And I fish with that guy. Mr. I better not name names. We should probably bleep those guys out. I don't know. But some of the other teachers, I hunt with one, spend a lot of time with him. No idea how he votes.
Yeah.
Don't care. So, but there have been there's been some teachers who have pushed back pretty hard. I lost a couple of friendships over my political views, where I just dug my heels in and said, you're wrong. And I can prove it. Yeah. And that was the end of that. And I had another teacher. This is another reason why I think that homeschooling is probably an option for people. We had a staff member who, the allegation was, I talked to some students and they would come in. This happened over the course of several years. They come into my class, my honor civics class, crying. And of course, I'm a teacher. I'm not completely heartless. The first thing I want to say is, come on, buck up. But then you say, well, what's the problem? Well, he did it again, Mr. Deming. He did it again. And all right, no names. So this teacher would tell the students, this is the allegation. Now, again, I never saw it happen, that they couldn't say God bless you if somebody sneezed in their class.
Wow.
And it was pretty hostile environment for people of faith. So if you're a person of faith and you had a teacher in a public school system that was running down people with faith constantly, you could see why homeschooling would be an option there.
Yeah, and I think that it looks pretty clear that at least some of the policy proposals, or at least the way that the left has been looking, it seems as if they're going to try to come after the religious groups within the public education sphere, or not allow them to have private schooling at all, which is very concerning.
Yeah, I think there's been a war on a religion now for a good decade. It's been blatant, and it's getting worse. It's getting more directive. I've seen, the Supreme Court, I've talked about the Supreme Court a lot. The Supreme Court just had a ruling where, we talked about it, right? Where what was the name of the case? I can't remember. Do you remember the name of the case?
I can look it up really quick.
But anyway, the Catholic Church can say, no, we're not going to work with same-sex couples with adoption agencies. We're just not going to do it. The Supreme Court supported that, said, well, no, you don't have to. That's a hopeful sign, I think. nobody should be forced to work with somebody they don't want to, particularly if that group violates their beliefs.
Yeah, I know we talked about the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo, I believe.
Is that the one? I don't remember. It don't matter.
Oh, Catholic Social Services.
That sounds right.
Yeah. But yeah, it
Anyway,
does look very promising. And you and I have had a lot of conversations. And what I find interesting about libertarianism, and I was going to make this point earlier, is so on the point of like calling you a conservative, for people who might not understand what libertarianism is, um, it might be interesting to hear that like you can be a conservative, like socially, but politically libertarian, just because politically you believe that you shouldn't be able to use force against others, whereas uh, so it's kind of like live and let be to an extent, as long as you're not harming other people, but you can still live a conservative lifestyle within that. Um, you're just not going to prohibit other people's lifestyles. But what I was going to say about this in particular is that um, with Supreme Court cases, I found that you and I will always get in these conversations where we're like, do we support these Supreme Court cases, or do you think this was a good ruling? And we're always caught. We're like, yeah, like at face value, yes, but there are all these principles that we have to follow, and it's like we're kind of outside of this paradigm. It's like we're not even thinking within the same system that others are working in, and I found that has been the best thing about this philosophy, and being able to talk to you about it, because the most engaging conversations I've had have been with you, because you are extremely knowledgeable about this. So, and you know the principles.
yeah, well, the principles are important. Like you said, I can't imagine that. See, libertarianism to me is a common sense way of looking at the world. So, violation of the NAP, that's taxation is theft. Those make sense to me. Which, by the way, I wrote taxation is theft on my marker boards and left it up there all year. I didn't get any pushback. Nobody said anything. I finally said it out loud one time just to see if anybody was paying attention, and half the kids in the class nodded their head. That's
Yeah,
hilarious.
I think you either said something about you had taxation as theft on the board our year, and then you also wrote something either about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln that may have been a little controversial.
Yeah, yeah. Under Abe Lincoln's portrait, I had worst president question mark.
Yeah.
I got some pushback on that. One kid actually raised his head. He says, "Mr. Deming, that makes me mad." And I said, "Well, let's talk about it."
Yeah.
And so we got a 20-minute conversation, 25-minute conversation about Abraham Lincoln. I got to say all kinds of terrible things that Abraham Lincoln did, and shot that kid's worldview down. Not that that's what I necessarily wanted. I just wanted him to know the truth. So you can go ahead and say that Abraham Lincoln was a great president, but you have to acknowledge that he had some problems, like the 600,000 people that died in the Civil War, where, as I think Brian McClanahan said, the South chose secession. Lincoln chose war. Well, so isn't he a bad guy?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest teller like that might be a little time sensitive or relevant to what's going on right now is with the Juneteenth thing. That I think that the whole conversation around Juneteenth was kind of like because the whole history behind that is that during Juneteenth, when the soldiers came in, the Emancipation Proclamation finally applied to them, right? So it was like these slaves were finally free because of the Emancipation Proclamation. But if people just looked a little further, they would realize that these slaves were not the last slaves to be freed, because the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to states in rebellion. So it's like, if the guy really was who these people really want to say he is, why didn't he try to do anything to the northern slaves? And then you start to ask questions like habeas corpus and all of these things that kind of blew my mind in that class. And I think the textbook actually kind of covered a little of those things. So I was kind of impressed by that too.
Yeah, the textbook is actually quite good. It depends on the interpretation of the teacher. I would tell parents, make sure that you get your kids into a We the People program. If they don't have one at your school, make sure you start one. I'm actually not sure that's a great idea anymore, because, and I have seen some of the people in Center for Civic Education speak, and I haven't been terribly impressed with their libertarian principles. So they're statists, right, to the ground. And you can argue with them all day about Abraham Lincoln, and they will, well, he freed the slaves. Well, no, he didn't free the slaves. He didn't free a single slave.
Yeah.
Right. And he wasn't really somebody who was against slavery. He said over and over again, Black people and white people, Negroes and white people can never be equal. He said that. He wanted to send them back to Africa, the great emancipator.
And then he has that one quote about if I could preserve the Union without freeing one single slave, I would. If I could preserve the Union by freeing them all, I would, or something like that. So, I mean, he's stating his goals pretty clearly right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's no question that the guy really wasn't an emancipator, and that the Emancipation Proclamation was a war effort. It wasn't really humanitarian at all.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So anyway, was that a different topic? Did we jump into something else?
Yeah, I don't know how we got to that. I think we probably started with education somewhere.
Yeah. So, oh yeah. So I really like the program. I like the text. We the People and Center for Civic Education, and I think Chuck Quigley, who started that, is just a great guy. And he's a good man. However, I think also that again, if you have a teacher whose worldview is that capitalism is bad and democracy rules, I think you're in for a lot of trouble, because I think that's the interpretation that most people put on the Constitution and our system today. And it's inaccurate. It's wrong. It would horrify all of the framers virtually, except maybe Alexander Hamilton. So.
Yeah, that is another takeaway that I took from your class, was how bad Hamilton was. And I was really happy to see, and I actually wrote Kevin Gutzman about this to see if he knew about it. Hamilton, it was found out that he may have owned slaves, and this was just happened like this year. And I loved it so much, because it was like these people could no longer hold him as like their saint, like it was like they would always point to everything that he said and kind of like take all of these terrible principles from Hamilton simply off of this basis, but they no longer have that anymore. So they're all on equal footing. And he's like, yeah, I'm not surprised. And meanwhile, they attack Jefferson.
Yeah, for sure. Even though, and I didn't realize Hamilton had slaves. He sure is yeah, I haven't heard that story, so I don't really know what you're referring to.
Yeah,
maybe send me that, would you?
Yeah, I'll send it to you afterwards, and I'll link to it if I find it. And I don't know if it was definitive proof, but they're starting to think that he may have had slaves.
Yeah. Why wouldn't that throw a monkey wrench into everything?
Yeah.
And good. I mean, statism kept people enslaved for decades, right? And statism attempts to keep everyone as slaves of the state forever. So that's kind of, you don't have shackles on, but you're a slave to the taxation. You're just a slave to the state, to the government. That's a terrible way to live.
Yeah, and I think I honestly think that people might wake up to it if at least people can like point to the source of all of this, because I mean, what we're going through right now, I think it should be pretty clear. Like in 2020 and now 2021 with Biden, I swear, if we go through another economic crisis without people pointing to the Federal Reserve, or at least questioning them, I have no idea what we're doing.
No hope. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they're deliberately obscure about what they do. When they set that up, it was secret. And what was that, at Jekyll Island?
Yeah.
So that whole history is frankly pretty suspicious. and how that whole thing is set up. And I think that's one of the reasons why Woodrow Wilson is worthy of all kinds of condemnation. I think he may be one of the, well, he's got to be the top 5 worst presidents.
Mhm.
And that's just one of the reasons.
Yeah,
But anyway, if people don't figure out that the government cannot help them, cannot save them, we're doomed.
Mhm.
Now, I think I'm actually feeling much more optimistic than I was just 6 months ago. So how many nullification ordinances or laws have been passed in states, including Montana, by the way, where the states have said we're not going to cooperate. In fact, it'd be illegal for our people to cooperate with the federal authorities on gun control. Well, you may not remember this. I think I spoke about this in class many times, but Montana legalized medical marijuana some years ago, 15 years ago. And the local law enforcement collaborated with the federal government in shutting those down. Well, that's illegal in Montana now, and in a number of other states. That's actually a very hopeful sign. It's like when California was going to secede over the immigration
Yeah.
issue. All right, secede. So secession's okay now because California says it is. Well,
Yeah.
the concept was, before everybody laughed about secession. Well, it's on the table. I'm very the decentralization, that's the answer.
Mhm. I've found that on college campuses, like I can't agree with leftists all the time about social policies, obviously, and social issues, but I have really been trying to get at them through the decentralization angle, and I really think that that's what libertarians have to do, because I think it's where people can compromise the most. And I remember I was pointing out, like, I was just making this argument because so Prince versus United States, I think that was out of Montana, like the sheriff Prince, he essentially says that the federal government can't commandeer local resources. That's a
Right.
Montana issue. So that's a local issue, right? Like, we have the precedent here. And then I would point to, like, Missoula and the sanctuary cities that they have. I'm like, that's another one. We have another precedent here. And then marijuana in, like, Colorado, like, these are democratic issues that you support. Can you see this on principle, why we should just support localism, and how this could benefit us all, and we could live in communities that look like the communities we want to live in, rather than trying to force them on others?
Yeah. So I'm absolutely, I think you're absolutely right. And just this morning, my wife and I were talking about a issue that we were reading some news article about. Did you see where there was a school board meeting someplace, and in the meeting, some of the parents apparently said something that the crowd agreed with, and the crowd clapped. And so the school board decided to call the cops on him, and the police came in. I don't know if they're deputies or city police, and hauled at least one guy away in handcuffs.
Wow.
So what I said was, well, first place, you've got a local school board, so that those people can be voted out. And reading the story, they probably should be.
Mhm.
The second place is that you can deal much more easily with a local law enforcement agency like a deputy sheriff or a sheriff, who are subject to elections as well, than you can with the national, say the military or the FBI or any of those groups. A lot easier to work around those guys than it is the national groups. And so that local angle is really going to be our savior, I think.
Yeah, and the thing is people point to, like, the Constitution and the Supremacy Clause, right? And I mean, if you want to give the answer to that objection, I'll let you do that.
Well, yeah. So there is a supremacy clause, and if you read it the way it's been read the last 150 years, you might think it actually is something that we have to pay attention to. But I find it fascinating that people who want to read that section of the Constitution as written will have all kinds of interpretations for other parts of the Constitution not as written. Okay, so we're either going to read the whole thing the way it was written or none of it. So that's my first objection to that ridiculous argument. Second thing is the states created the national government. The national government did not create the states. And so as far as I can see, the states can just thumb their nose at the national government because it's a creature of their own making. I don't buy the supremacy clause for a second. I know there's probably some other more intellectual arguments, but I say to the states like Montana, no, we're not enforcing your gun laws. No, we're not sending any soldiers to your army. We're not going to pay the income tax anymore. Those are things I'd love to see, and I think that stuff's coming.
Yeah, I do too. And I think that there actually is another objection to it. I think that it has something to do with the word, how is it phrased? It's something therein, and it's referring to, and it's often omitted, like there's often ellipses when people write it out, and they're omitting the part that requires them to follow the Constitution. So it has something to do with all powers. Here, let me see if I can actually find the text, because
yeah, it's too bad you didn't have a camera on, because I've got my pocket Constitution right here. All right. See, this is fun for me. This is a fun exercise. This Constitution and laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof. So in pursuance thereof of the Constitution, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Okay, so there's two things where I think you're right. When they read this, the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof the Constitution. And so if it's an unconstitutional law, then clearly the states don't have to honor as supreme this particular law.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, because they also have to account for the vested powers that the federal government has. Because, I mean, if they go outside the bounds of those powers, then it's not in pursuant of the Constitution. So I think that that's another area where these people get the supremacy clause wrong. And I think that that's where the authority to nullify comes from, is because, like, in a sense, the federal government can just ignore or the states can just ignore what the federal government has done. And then if people say, well, the federal government's stronger or something like that, something interesting that I found is that for a lot of these federal laws, the reason that the anti-commandeering principle is so important, that was established in like the Prince versus US case, is that the federal government actually relies a lot on localities to enforce their laws. So, I mean, you can just kind of ignore this, or a state can just ignore these things, and the federal government can't do much.
Right, that's absolutely right. And that Jay Prince guy was the sheriff of Ravalli County there, or Hamilton. And it seems like there was another sheriff that they went in together on this this case, and yet they named it for the Jay Prince guy. Yeah, anti-commandeering doctrine, clearly that makes more sense than having the national government be able to call into service anybody they want.
Yeah.
You know, and then that also is something, can the national government call in the militia? Well, it can, but do they have to answer? There's another question. Anyway, so all kinds of questions where I think the United States government, the general government, has interpreted the Constitution and increased their power over and over and over again, to the point where, you know, the president thinks that they can do executive orders. They can pass an executive order, and people at the local level have to respond. They have to do it. Well, where's that? Is that in the Constitution? I don't think that's in the Constitution. So anyway.
Mr. Deming, it's a living and breathing document.
Yeah.
Another
I'm triggered.
yeah, exactly. Well, another thing about this whole issue, and maybe this is what we'll finish up on, is how many times the federal government has threatened to pull funding, because that is a way that maybe they can try to threaten the state, especially in a state like Montana, where we kind of are pretty dependent on federal funding. Do you have some of those instances in mind right now? Like, would you be able to recall them? I know they've threatened highway funding, education funding many times. And when I've told even leftists about these cases, like I know one is about Michelle Obama's food program or whatever. Like they threatened to pull funding over that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there are quite a few that you told me about.
Well, the one that immediately jumps in mind for me is the fiasco that was the reasonable and prudent speed limit on our highways, interstate highways. And so since Montana is dependent for, our road construction on federal funds, that was a pretty serious threat when the federal government says, no, you have to have a posted speed limit. What difference does it make to the national government, people in DC, if we don't have a posted speed limit on our interstates? What difference does that make to anybody? But that was a threat that I think they were willing to pull our highway funding if we didn't change it over. So we changed it over. That's a silly example. Frankly, I don't think it's that important, but it's just an example, as far as I'm concerned, of federal or general government overreach. This is ridiculous. Why would they care? Why should they care?
There's, I think they also did the same with drinking age laws. I think
that could be right.
Yeah, it was 18, and then they forced the same thing for us to turn it to 21. They threatened to do the same thing with the transgender bathrooms. They would pull education funding. And we moved pretty quickly on that. And I mean, like, these issues aren't like maybe the transgender bathroom one is more conservative, but there are issues like that, like if you told a leftist that they're going to pull education funding because of this, they're going to freak out. And it's obvious that they're holding that funding hostage. So, I mean, I think that something that Montana really needs to focus on is becoming pretty reliant and sustainable, and just figure out how to exist without that funding. And you and I have talked about potential courses of action that, like, a governor or a legislature can do against, like, the president if they try to do that. And one that I've really entertained is, like, just, well, then we don't give you taxes. like we'll just reroute our taxes to the treasury.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a way to do that, to put the pressure on the federal government, although they don't obviously depend on our tax money. They kind of depend on their printing press to make money. But so I think Montana should just call their bluff. So you may know this, Governor Schweitzer, when they first passed the Real ID Act. Do you know about that? I don't remember if we talked about that very much.
I know that we pushed it back a lot, but I don't know the politics behind it.
So Governor Schweitzer, Democrat, said to the federal government, no, we're not going to have a Real ID. And the reason why is that at the time, Montana's driver's licenses were about as secure as any in the country. In fact, maybe the most secure. And there's kind of a funny story that's involved at the University of Montana there, but we don't have time to tell it yet. But anyway, so he said, no, go ahead. We don't have to fly airplanes. And the federal government backed off on that Real ID. Now, it may not have been all Governor Schweitzer, but the one thing that I was proud of him for was telling the federal government, no, we're not doing that.
That's an amazing story. Yeah. I didn't know that, but that is awesome. So that's proof that we can do it.
Right. And should.
Yeah. And 2020, I mean, I agree with you. I do feel very optimistic, and I can't really tell what it is. It's kind of just a lot of things happening at once, and it kind of feels like it's in the air was just like the way that culture has received a lot of libertarian voices. I mean, I'm a big Dave Smith fan, and he's been all over Fox News recently, and so is Spike Cohen. And then all of these cases of states nullifying stuff. It's been really great to see. But on the other hand, there's some more scary things like Joe Biden the other day pointing out, or like announcing this program where you can call your family in if they're
Yeah.
radicals or something like that, and how they define radicals. It kind of is defined in a way where it groups in both leftists who oppose capitalism and libertarians. And CIA John Brennan, he got on there and on TV, and he said he grouped libertarians in with racists and all of this stuff,
Yeah.
and we were part of the insurrection, or the quote unquote insurrection at the Capitol. So I'm very optimistic in the power and the reaction to the federal government, but there's still going to be a little crackdown.
I think you're right, but it depends on how much liberty people have in their hearts. And if they don't have any liberty, then it's all of that is going to work. But if we are really believe in liberty in this country, we'll push back. We'll push back hard. I think there will be. So the gun laws, the attempts at getting rid of AR-15s and other quote unquote weapons of war. I wonder if that isn't going to be the tipping point for a lot of people. He's been pretty. Biden has been pretty certain that he's going to try to take away those types of firearms. Now, I don't have one, and I'm not that personally worried about having to buy one. But if I want to get one, I should be able to get one. And that's a topic for another time. But I think that's one of the tipping points that could happen. People aren't going to stand for that.
Yeah. And today he made an announcement about how if you were to take on the federal government, you would need jets and you would need much higher firepower than you guys do, because and then he made some comment about how, or when the Constitution was first ratified, that even then they had certain regulations on firearms. And he said even back then they couldn't own cannons. And I actually recalled right then in one of my presentations in We the People, I let this slip probably at an inopportune time, and it came off pretty bad. But I made a comment about James Madison's a letter of marque to a privateer who had a ship with a cannon on it. So Joe Biden said that even in the founders' days, you couldn't own a cannon. And there's literal proof, because James Madison wrote a letter of marque to this privateer, and he wasn't necessarily licensing him to have the cannon and possess the cannon. What he was doing was he was giving him the ability to capture British ships and stuff like that. So a lot of people will say that the letter of marque only granted him authority to have the cannon, but he already did. Like that, and that's enough proof to say, like, people at that time had these weapons, and what they expected was that you would have the same weaponry as the government, or at least enough to keep the government from infringing on your rights.
That's absolutely the case. And in fact, I know we're going to have to go here pretty quick, but I can't leave without saying this. So the firearms, the firepower commensurate with fighting a standing army, which virtually all of the founders agreed, all of them agreed was a threat to liberty. Standing army is a threat to liberty. So whatever it takes to counter that threat is what we have to have. And that's just no question about it. I mean, you can't argue that.
Yeah.
And Joe Biden is completely and historically and conveniently wrong on that issue.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we're definitely running out of time, and I could keep talking with you, and every time we talk, we have conversations like this. So if there's anything else that you want to say, and if you want to just tell the audience anything, please do, and then we can let you go, and I'll have you back on as soon as possible.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. This is kind of fun for me, and just hanging out and visiting. That's also pretty gratifying for an old teacher. So thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
It's the weekend and we can let go. It's the full send.